Here we go. Hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen. I am so excited for you educating yourself by listening to this podcast. Whether you are a newbie landlord, a nugget landlord, or a landlord at a pickle, we are hoping to provide some solutions for you. And today I have an amazing guest that I have been waiting to have on the show. And when we do a prep call, it's usually 15, 20 minutes, maybe half an hour prep call. Our prep call with my guest today was over an hour, only because we're so passionate about the same thing. It's sort of like you both speak the same language and you just resonate. Well, I resonate with today's guest, so hopefully we don't go too long, but that's okay. So my guest and I speak the same language today about landlording, and we make it fun, which is really fun. She's an amazing poetry writer, but she's also, let me get this right, the senior education content manager at Turbo Tenant, which is a great company. I'm super happy to have them on the show finally. Joining me today from Denver is Krista Reuther. Hi, Krista.
Hello, Jen. What a warm and wonderful introduction. I could not stop smiling the whole time.
It's awesome. I'm so happy to have you on the show. And I've already said this, that we're going to end up having multiple shows because you're just a wealth of knowledge and lots of questions. So we picked the low-hanging fruit for today's show. In today's show, we're going to talk about tenant screening. We're going to talk about tenant qualification, international applicants. And then we could talk about fees. We can talk about, how Turbo Tenant's doing more education series. I mean, there's tons of stuff we could do, and I know it's going to bleed into more shows. Where should we start? Tell us how you got to Turbo Tenant.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I have to take you back quite a ways. When I was in college, I really was struggling on my ramen noodle budget. So I said, hey, what am I good at? I'm a curious person. I love words. I like to edit. Let's do that. Let's try freelance editing. So I jumped in and I said, hey, you know what? I will edit everything. And I started building up my business there. And eventually I got a very interesting proposal slid across my desk, specifically for a commercial real estate adventure over in Jerusalem, a luxury hotel proposition
In Jerusalem.
in Jerusalem, of all places. Me in Fort
Wow.
Collins, Colorado, just casually eating some dry ramen because I'm trying to save on water costs. And I'm like, oh, okay, let's take a look at this. I'll start looking into it. And as I'm going through, I am realizing how much wealth and potential there is, specifically both for that project, but in the real estate space in general. Now, I was a first generation college student. My parents do not come from wealth. So the idea that getting into real estate could unlock these doors and all of these zeros and commas in a potential ROI, it really changed things for me. I was so flabbergasted. I remember just sitting there and being like, I don't think I've ever seen that many commas in one line before. How is this real? And so naturally my curiosity got the best of me. I start poking around. I'm looking at other things in real estate, and I kind of kept it on the back burner because again, it felt very out of reach for me at the time. But I still loved writing. I still loved editing. So at every job that I got after that, I was trying to pick up writing and editing portions of it, getting into every single thing. And eventually, I landed my first full-time content-related position at the CE Shop. The CE Shop is a leading provider of real estate agent education. And so once again, it felt like someone was just opening a door in my mind where I could say, oh, wow, look at the potential that real estate has to offer. And I learned how people talked about real estate deals, all the different specializations that an agent could have. And it just got me so excited about the space that when eventually an opportunity at Turbo Tenant arose where they said, hey, do you want to come over here and you want to be a writer and a content creator? How about you start educating people on this stuff too? I said, oh, this is a dream come true. Let me hop right in. So a little over 2 years ago, I did exactly that. I came over. I hosted my first webinar in the first month that I was there about landlord insurance and the importance of that. And I've had the distinct pleasure of deep diving into topics ever since.
That's awesome. Now, you and I both know that in any industry, there's certain aspects that are kind of like, that's not my favorite. And then there's other ones that jump out as, oh my gosh, absolutely favorite. What kind of topics in the real estate space jump out for you as favorites?
There are so many great topics. I would say, first and foremost, Anything to do with the Fair Housing Act really just tickles me. I want to know more about it. I want to make sure people are following it, that they understand it. And that translates into a lot of other branches of this area, right? So like tenant screening is a great one because it seems so simple on its face, but as you peel back the layers, there's a lot to understand there. And I love those kinds of topics. I am an expert peeler where I go, okay, so I kind of get this, but what about that? And we just go down the rabbit hole.
I love it. An expert peeler.
That's me.
Industry term. Well, let's talk about tenant screening. I evaluated earlier this year, did a huge evaluation after attending Podcast Evolutions, which is all about how to analyze what your listeners are listening to, what they want to hear more about. And one of the glaring things that my listeners want to hear more about is tenant screening. So with that as one of your favorites, let's talk about what Turbo Tenant can do. Let's talk about what you would recommend on tenant screening. It's a pain point for people. So how do we help that?
Major pain point. And again, it's one of those things that if you're talking about it and you have no experience in the game, you're like, well, of course, you just find someone who can pay the rent. But really, there's so many different factors that go into that. So first and foremost, Turbo Tenant tries to make it as easy as possible for you, right? We have it set up where our tenant screening is free for the landlord, which means you have your leads go through, they can fill out a rental application, they pay that fee once, and we will pull their entire credit screen, or excuse me, their tenant screening report, which includes their credit history, eviction history, and criminal history where legally allowed. And then you can look at it and you get a clear view of who they are, what they've been doing with their money, and if they're going to be a good fit for your property based on some of those really key factors. So for example, we have a stoplight system with the credit scores. So if it's red, that means, hey, pause. There's stuff going on here that you might want to look at. If it's ranked in the yellow spot, that means, hey, okay, they're not doing the worst, but there's still plenty of items you might want to look at, such as their lines of credit, their past due balances, things that are all included in the actual report. And then, of course, you have your green folks who are looking great. They're healthy credit scores, which means you still want to do your due diligence, but it should give you confidence as you move through. And again, we make it as easy as possible for landlords and tenants to connect over that. We also handle some of the back end, which I'm sure we'll talk about later in terms of denying applicants. And we really just want to streamline the process and keep everyone legally compliant, help you find a tenant who's going to pay rent on time and in full and treat your property well. That's what we all want at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's important when we talk about tenant screening to first acknowledge that it's not a place to go with your gut. There are so many avenues in life where your gut is going to lead you to the right spot. Tenant screening is not one of them. Do not do it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, absolutely. I've seen so many people going, yeah, well, they showed up early and their car was clean and they're wearing a great suit. And I'm thinking everybody is on their best behavior when they're applying for a rental. Everybody is on their best behavior. But that's where, as a landlord or even a property manager, you've got to absolutely do your due diligence because you cannot go with your gut. You've got to confirm it. Even if they give you a pay stub, you still have got to call and verify that they're still employed at this company because they might have got fired last week and that's an old pay stub kind of thing, right? So, but Krista, let's talk about when a tenant has some aspects of the qualifications, but not all. Awkward, super awkward. How do we deal with that?
I would say first, what you're going to want to do, even before you get into the situation, is write out what your tenant screening criteria is. Documentation is your best friend in really all realms of business, but especially in this one as a landlord. You want to make sure you have it laid out. Okay, I'm looking for my ideal tenant. They're going to have a credit score of 650 and above, and they're going to make 3 times the monthly rent, and they're going to have 2 references that are positive. So you really outline what you're looking for from the jump. Then when you have someone who comes through and you can just easily look at them, compare them to your list and say, okay, well, Jimmy's credit score is a little bit lower than what I usually do. Where else does he align? Is he meeting most of the criteria? Is there something about his credit score that I need to take into consideration? Like evictions and some other things, bankruptcy, can be attached to your credit score for 7 years. So if you look at that and you say, okay, 6 years ago, Jimmy was 20 and he had to declare bankruptcy. Poor Jimmy. We really feel for the guy. But what is he doing now? How does this show you that he's changed and that he's now a reliable guy? Can you look at his current past due debts? Can you look at what he's doing with opening lines of credit? The answer is yes, with a comprehensive screening report. And you can start to kind of piecemeal together and see if this is someone you want to move forward in the process. I would also say that you might get people, depending on your population, who don't have a credit score. College students are a great example because you need to have at least 6 months of credit history to even generate a score. And if you have an 18-year-old who's never rented anywhere before, they're not going to have that for you. So I would say have some contingency plans laid out, contingency criteria, where you say, okay, if someone doesn't have a credit score, I'm going to evaluate why. It could be that they're very young. It could also be that they are very old. You see it on both sides of the spectrum. It also could be that they are an international applicant. And then you could look at, I want these specific documents and I want to look at these things to assess creditworthiness.
Yeah, that's interesting about international applicants because we've got lots of folks who are immigrating both in the US but also in Canada. You know, my listenership is in the US and Canada because I have rentals on both sides of the border. And so I run into this all the time. And so what happens? How do we approach international applicants who have no rental history in the US or in Canada? And then, they have no credit. Like, what do we even do with that?
Right? It's a whole, again, we're peeling back those layers because I've talked to many property managers and landlords who say, oh, I just don't deal with them. And then I have to say, if you're in America, you are violating the Fair Housing Act. And here's how you can go about it in a more legally compliant way. But you're right, there are folks in the pool who just don't have a credit score for whatever reason. There are a few other countries that have credit scores that maybe you could look at what their credit score is there and do a little bit of research. But if you want to save the headache, there are a couple other documents that you could pull in instead. Specifically, you're going to want to make sure that you have a copy of their passport. If they have a visa, ask for a copy of that as well, because that will help you verify their identity.
Right.
Plus, you can lean on previous landlords. So ask them for a letter of reference. Really, you want to make sure that this is someone that the landlord would hopefully rent to again. And I know anytime I bring up previous landlords and letters of reference, I usually have a naysayer who's like, well, what if they just want them out the door and they don't want them in there? Well, that's why I say get at least two. Because if they can produce at least two, there's a likelihood that there's some truth, and not only just some truth, but you can validate the experiences and see if there are common threads between the letters. On the financial side of things, to prove creditworthiness, ask for a credit reference letter. So this can detail a financial relationship between your lead and either an individual or a business so that you can better understand their trustworthiness and their ability to make rent payments on time. So it could be asset documentation or a letter of financier support, anything that helps illustrate how they treat money and how they treat their debts. You'll also want to pull in at least 2 months of pay stubs. And if they're employed in the US or if they're a part of, let's say, an international student program, there should be some kind of documentation regarding how their bills are going to be paid. You can request that as well.
And typically if somebody's moving, that's what I do. If they're moving into a new area and that's why they're asking for the rental, I go, okay, then there's usually a job offer, a relocation assistance, or some kind of document that they can provide. And I ask for a copy of that as well. I'd never heard about the letter of credit worthiness, especially for an international applicant who's relocating from, let's say, overseas. Let's say the company's like, a major conglomerate like Amazon or Walmart or Google. Like that's what happens. And they're moving back to the States and they want one of my rentals. Well, there should be a way to, to confirm, even if they don't have US credit, that they would have some way to make a reference letter. And if it's not in writing, according to my tenant screening, it didn't happen. I'm going to throw a curveball at you though, Krista, because this is what we do. What about convicted felons? Somebody who's a convicted felon, they don't declare it because it's not on the tenant application, form. But when we run their background check, they've got a criminal history. Let's say it's either nonviolent or violent. We can pick whichever.
Sure.
What's the thoughts of a convicted felon? Because this is a white hot topic right now on social media. White hot. How do we deal with convicted felons?
White hot topic. So when we are talking about convicted felons, the Department of Urban Development and Housing, HUD, they suggest not treating it like a broad stroke situation, right? So they really want you to examine the case of each and every individual who comes through in these circumstances. it's easiest when we talk about nonviolent crime. So what I would say, we'll start there and I'll hit the hard one. Don't worry, I'm not weaseling out of it. So if there is a nonviolent crime, first you want to assess, when did it happen? Was there a conviction? Was there time served or otherwise proof that this behavior is no longer going on in the person's life, right? So if this is something that, let's say, happened again 7 years ago, we're going to pick on Jimmy, poor Jimmy. 7 years ago, Jimmy has a nonviolent criminal charge. Did he actually get arrested, put in jail? Did he serve time? Did he do community service in order to make better the space in which he has committed this crime? If the answers to all of this are in the positive, right? He hasn't had any recurring behaviors. He has been an upstanding member of society. He's paying his bills. He's doing all these things. Then I would say to take that into consideration. If he meets the rest of your criteria, move him forward, right? If it is a recurring behavior, drugs, let's say, something where you are continuing to do it over time, that could be something disqualifying, especially because most leases have standard language that says, hey, the creation, selling, etc. of drugs is not permitted here. That is not going to work. Okay, well, this pattern of behavior suggests that it could continue in your rental. I would say look elsewhere for an applicant. Now, the big kahuna, the violent crimes, right? It's really hard and it's really scary because you're looking at this, and especially if you have a multifamily property, but even if you have a single family one, you're probably thinking about your neighbors and other tenants, people in the community. So once again, do not paint with a broad brush. I want you to really examine the details of whatever you've pulled up in that background check, right? Where legally allowed, Turbo Tenant will pull this for you. You can see, okay, again, was there a conviction? What are the details of this crime? Has time been served? Has there been enough time passed where this is something in the person's history, but not their present? And if you see that there is anything that jumps out and says, hey, this behavior is continuing on, in that case, it's probably not going to be a good fit, and you can just politely decline. I will say one area where there are more broad strokes that HUD allows is in cases with endangerment to children, specifically sexual crimes against children. So in those cases, by and large, you are, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm just a good looking researcher, but by and large, you are allowed to turn them down and say, hey, we are not going to be moving forward with this, particularly in a multifamily situation, or if you know that there are kids in the neighborhood, if you're near a school. Those are more cut and dry for folks.
Gotcha. Well, and I know you and I are going to talk more about Fair Housing Act, and there's things that are called protected classes. And I know that always comes up saying convicted felons is not a protected class, but when you're talking about familial groups or age groups like children, like elders, things like that, those are protected classes depending on how you classify them. So I want to be careful when I say that. And so convicted felons doesn't fit any of those molds. And so it's really that one especially, you cannot go with your gut and say, oh, they're a convicted felon, that's it. But if it's from 30 years ago, it was nonviolent and it wasn't continuing and everything else is great, they've clearly straightened themselves up, it might work. And I'll be honest, I have scared quite a few tenants, former tenants, straight when I could have evicted them. I should have evicted them. I basically said, get your crap together or I'm going to evict you. And you know what? Those people, now I see them. I ran into one of them recently and I was so proud going, I scared him straight and now he's a bank teller. Like before, like I could have just evicted him and just, taught him a huge lesson. And the truth is that sometimes these new tenants that are, brand new renters, they've never, ever had to live on their own. They've never experienced life without mommy or daddy. And so it's tough to go through this. That's just one example. But I'm really, really happy to hear a little bit more about convicted felons because they don't fit the mold. International applicants don't fit the mold either because we have this rental criteria, sort of square pegs, square holes. We want to make sure we've got all this. And then you're like, well, wait a minute. This is not fitting. This is not conforming. This doesn't work. This doesn't work. So let's just cut to the chase. Let's say that you've got your rental criteria, you've got your applications, and the tenant just straight up doesn't qualify. How do we tell a tenant no?
It's going to be an awkward conversation, and I know you are so good at those. But I would say if you have a listener, if you're out there and you're like, ugh, I really hate the idea of turning someone down, it doesn't have to be scary. There are a couple of rules that you'll need to follow, but first and foremost, you can be polite but vague. You could just say, hey, we are not moving forward with your application. Thank you for your time. Best of luck to you. And most tenants are going to let that be. And that suffices, I'd say 90% of the time, right? Now, if you've pulled their credit report, the extra step that you want to make sure that you are meeting is sending them an adverse action letter. An adverse action letter is going to remind the tenant that they have the right to pull their credit report from the credit bureaus and call the credit bureaus if there are any mistakes or inconsistencies. That's not between you and TransUnion, that's between the tenant and TransUnion. But you have to remind them that that's their right. So here at Turbo Tenant, we make it easy. If you are screening tenants with us, we'll actually send that to your tenants on your behalf, or I should say your leads at that point. We'll send it over so that you don't have to worry about the adverse action letter or getting the wording right because it's very specific legalese. Instead, they get reminded of their rights and you can go about your day moving forward with the applicant who is going to become your tenant.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Now let's keep going in the screening process. When do we charge an application fee and when do we not? And this, I have to remind my listeners, because my listeners are both in Canada and the US, this can depend on your geographic location. But what's your take on this, Krista?
So you're spot on when you say it depends on your geographic location. I mean, even in the US, state to state, there are different rules. In fact, here in Colorado, where I live, there's some different rules city to city about what you can and cannot charge for a rental application. So always do your due diligence, get really familiar with your local laws and stay up with them as they change. But on a base level, I would say you want to charge a rental application to ensure that you are not depleting your funds as a business owner, right? Because there is a cost to running and pulling this information for a tenant screening report. Here at Turbo Tenant, again, the tenant ends up paying for that, so it's free for landlords, which is really nice. But if you're in a situation where you have a strong allegiance to a different tenant screening provider, you're still going to probably have to pay them for it. So what you need to do is when you have a lead who's interested, maybe they've come to a showing, maybe they've just written to you and said, hey, I saw your posting on realtor.com. I'm really excited about it. To move them forward, before they actually pay, I would say ask some quick pre-screening questions. This is also a feature of Turbo Tenant where we ask some industry leading ones so you can get an idea, is this going to be a good fit, from little details like when they want to move in to their self-reported income. You want to make sure this matches up before any money changes hands, because that way, if it's not a good fit, they feel good, they get to keep their application fee. You feel good because you didn't waste your time, and you can go find someone who's going to be better aligned with what you've got going on. So ask a couple of those. If it looks like it's a good fit, they want to move in around when it's going to be available, they have enough income, maybe they have pets and you allow pets, or they don't have pets and you don't allow pets, one of those beautiful kismet situations, right? At that point, you'll say, hey, here's my application. The cost is X. Make sure that that cost is in line with what is legally allowed in your area. Again, it varies state to state, but on average, it's usually between like $30 and $50. So once that's all done, they'll fill it out, they'll move through, and you'll get to see that report. If you're with Turbo Tenant, you'll see it in seconds as soon as they finish it up.
Awesome. Quick question. I know Turbo Tenant operates a lot in the US, and so you're using the word state and you've got, different words. But is Turbo Tenant going to go international anytime soon?
Our hope is that yes, we've been very secretly running some ads for our beautiful Canadians out there.
Good.
Just like Jen, following in your trailblazing footsteps, there are folks who have properties on both sides of the border. So we're seeing how it works. Canadians, if you if you want us badly enough, we will come over to you, because I think everybody could use these tools.
I love it. I love it. Now, Krista, as the senior education content manager at Turbo Tenant, you like that? I got it. I got it right. Rolled right off the tongue. I know you've got a bunch of education series for Turbo Tenant, webinars and other items. Tell us what education items, if there's a listener out there going, this pain point is this, what can they do to help themselves, help educate themselves, whether they need something today or in the future?
I would say first, head on over to turbotenant.com/thekey. That is a sign up page for our weekly newsletter, which will have recurring topics in it, including things about ESAs, emotional support animals, but also some different topics like what do you do when you're trying to plan out your estate planning? What do you need if you are looking to become a fully remote landlord like Jen? What are you looking for in your next tenant, in your next deal? XYZ. We try and cover the whole gambit for you, and we're also really open to feedback. So head over there, sign up for our newsletter. You'll start to see when we put on our monthly webinar series, which is always a good time, and not just because I make jokes throughout the entire presentation, but because there are just so many topics to discuss, and I love having that back and forth with the audience. But outside of that, in terms of broader scopes, I would say get really familiar with your local government site. And what I mean by that is here in Colorado, I believe the website is like denvergov.gov. Very simple. You'll be looking for that .gov at the end of the URL. That means that it's put on by a government. In Canada, it might be .ca for y'all specifically with government sites. But make sure that you understand where to find information about laws that are changing so that you can just keep yourself aware as things go through. I would also say maybe check in to see when your legislative sessions are. And if you can get involved in your local community or virtually through your community, that is going to be really good for you. So highly recommend that way you keep your thumb on the pulse of what's going on in your local market.
That is awesome. And Krista, I know you and I have talked about it because I'm going to start a speaking series here in 2025 and following. And I know you're doing lots of conferences all over the place in North America in general, not just in the States. So I'm excited about that because I know we've got great listenership in Toronto, Vancouver, and beyond in Canada as well. So I'm always trying to bring more resources to the listener out there, of course. If my listener wants to get a hold of you, how do they do that? How do they get a hold of Krista?
Please email me at krista@turbotenant.com. Really easy. First name at company name. I welcome any feedback. If there are topics that you're curious about, please let me know. Outside of the webinar series, I also write blogs, ebooks. I host 2 podcasts. So I'm always looking for things people want to know about so that I can dive in, do the work for you, and present what I find.
That is awesome. Krista, it's so much fun having you on the show. I know you and I could just go all these rabbit holes. It's all I can do to just stick to our framework because I know I don't want to run over, but so great to have you. Thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
Thank you so much for your time and wisdom. I've learned so much from you in just these 2 calls and really appreciate you.
Awesome. I know we'll have you back on the show, but we'll see you soon.
Thank you.